The casserole dish was still warm in my hands when my mother-in-law opened the front door, looked at me, and said, "Oh, we weren't sure you were still coming." I'd driven 4 hours from Columbus, with my 7-year-old daughter asleep in the back seat. I'd taken Friday off work, packed the car the night before, made my grandmother's green bean casserole from scratch because my mother-in-law had requested it specifically 3 weeks ago via text. I had the screenshot. I'd read it twice on the drive just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. My daughter stirred awake when I unbuckled her. She rubbed her eyes and asked if we were at Grandma's house. I told her yes. She smiled this big, crooked smile she gets when she's still half asleep, and I carried her inside before I let myself feel anything about the welcome we'd just received. The house smelled like pot roast and something floral, candles maybe. The dining room table was set for 8. I counted the chairs before I counted the people. 8 chairs. My husband's parents, his brother and sister-in-law, their 3 kids, my husband and me. That was 8. My daughter wasn't in the count. My mother-in-law saw me looking. She said, "Callie can sit at the little table in the kitchen. It's cozier for the kids." There were no other kids eating in the kitchen. Her grandchildren, all 3 of them, were already seated at the big table. My daughter was the only one being moved. I set the casserole on the counter. I said, "Where do you want this?" My voice was completely steady, which surprised me. My mother-in-law pointed to the counter without looking, already walking back toward the dining room, already done with that conversation. If you've ever stood in someone's kitchen holding food you made for them while your child gets assigned a separate table, subscribe and tell me what state you're in. I read every comment. I got Callie settled at the small kitchen table with a placemat and her cup. She didn't complain. She's 7. She didn't know what was happening. She started drawing on a paper napkin with a crayon she'd brought in from the car, happy as anything, and that somehow made it worse. Dinner started. My father-in-law carved the pot roast. My husband's brother, I'll call him my brother-in-law, made a toast about family. My mother-in-law accepted the compliments on the meal. Nobody mentioned the green bean casserole. It sat at the end of the counter untouched. Halfway through the main course, my mother-in-law looked at me across the table and said, "We've been thinking about Thanksgiving." I nodded. She said, "We'd like to do it here this year, but we're going to keep it smaller, just immediate family." She paused just long enough. "So probably not you and Callie." The table went quiet, not the kind of quiet where people are shocked, the kind where people already knew. My husband looked at his plate. I put my fork down. I looked at my mother-in-law and I said, "That's helpful to know." Then, I pushed my chair back, walked to the kitchen, picked up my daughter and her crayon and her paper napkin, told her we were going for a drive to get ice cream, and walked out the front door. My husband followed us to the parking lot. He said my name. I buckled Callie in and told her we'd find a Dairy Queen. She asked if we could get a Blizzard. I said absolutely. My husband said he didn't know his mom was going to say that. I told him I believed him. I also told him I needed him to think very carefully about what he did next, because what he did in the next 5 minutes was going to tell me everything I needed to know. He went back inside. I found a Dairy Queen 11 minutes away. Callie got an Oreo Blizzard. I got a coffee and sat across from her in a booth and watched her eat and thought about the joint account. We'd opened it 3 years ago when we bought the house. My salary covered the mortgage. My husband's salary covered utilities, groceries, his car payment. We also had a joint savings, $34,000, most of which was my tax return money rolled over for 2 years, and a bonus I'd received in March. There was also the vacation fund, a separate account we'd been building for 18 months, $200, earmarked for a trip to Portugal that my in-laws had recently suggested we use instead for a family reunion at a lake house they wanted to rent. I'd said sure at the time. I'd said sure to a lot of things. I opened my banking app while Callie worked on her blizzard. I looked at the vacation fund first. Then the joint savings. Then I opened my phone's notes app and started a list. What's mine? My direct deposits, my bonus money, my tax returns. What's shared? Utilities, mortgage, groceries, what I've been funding quietly. For Portugal account, the family reunion that was my money being repurposed for a trip I wasn't really invited to. Callie finished her blizzard and asked if we were going back to Grandma's house. I told her we were going to stay at a hotel tonight, just the two of us, like an adventure. She asked if the hotel had a pool. I told her we'd find one that did. I booked a Hampton Inn with an indoor pool from the Dairy Queen parking lot. 2 nights. I paid with my personal card. Then I texted my college roommate. She's a CPA, sharpest person I know, and called me back before I'd even started the car. She called me back before I'd even started the car. I explained the situation. She asked 3 questions in about 90 seconds. Was my name on the mortgage? Yes. Was the savings account in both names? Yes. Had I been the prime contributor? Yes. She could look at the deposit history and see clearly. She said, "Okay, you're not moving money tonight, but you are documenting everything tonight. But you are documents of tranche tonight. Send me screenshots of the last 6 months of transactions from every joint account. I'll have a picture of the full situation before you wake up tomorrow." I sent her everything from the hotel room, while Callie splashed in the pool 1 floor below, with a teenage lifeguard watching. 4 accounts, 18 months of transaction history. I organized it chronologically and labeled each deposit by source. She texted me back at 11:15 p.m. Your contributions to joint savings $27,400, his $6,600. Vacation fund $7,900, yours $300, his. You've also been covering an average of $340 in household costs that fall outside the agreed split. I can see it in the grocery charges and the utility overages. Over 18 months, that's $6,120 unaccounted. Total imbalance, north of $40,000. I read it twice. Then I went downstairs and watched my daughter do a handstand in the shallow end of the pool. My husband called 4 times that night. I let them go to voicemail. The 4th message was 40 seconds long. I listened to it once. He said his mother hadn't meant it the way it sounded. He said he'd talked to her and she'd clarified. He said I was overreacting. He said Callie hadn't even seemed upset. Callie is 7. She doesn't know yet what it means when the people who are supposed to love her count the chairs. I turned the phone over and went to sleep. As if it's already. In the morning, my roommate called. She walked me through it calmly, the way she always does, like she's reading weather data, not the financial history of my marriage. She said I had 3 options. I could do nothing, which wasn't really an option. I could have a direct conversation with my husband, with documentation, which was the first step regardless. Or I could begin separating my contributions from joint assets before any decisions were made that I didn't agree with. She said, the Portugal money is the most urgent. If that account is joint and accessible, and they're already planning to use it for a different trip, you need to address that in writing this week. I asked her what in writing looked like. She said an email to my husband, time-stamped, clearly stating my understanding of how the funds were designated and that I did not consent to redirecting them. She said to send it from my personal email, not our shared family account, and to BCC her. I wrote it from the hotel breakfast table, while Callie ate a waffle she'd made herself from the waffle maker, extremely proud, a little burnt at the edges. I kept it factual. Dates. Original purpose. My expectation that no changes would be made to the vacation fund without my explicit written agreement. I did not use the word family reunion. I did not mention his mother. I sent it at 8:47 a.m. He read it. I could see the read receipt. He didn't reply. We checked out at noon. I drove home. Callie slept most of the way. her paper napkin drawing folded on her lap. She'd finished it at some point, a picture of what appeared to be a dog in a swimming pool. My husband was home when we got there. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his phone. He looked up when we came in. Callie ran to him and hugged him and told him about the pool and the waffle maker. He hugged her back and looked at me over her head. After she went to her room to unpack her backpack with the solemnity of someone returning from a long expedition, he said, "We need to talk." I said, "Yes, we do." He said his mother had called him that morning. She'd told him I was being dramatic and that I'd embarrassed the family by leaving. He said she was upset that I hadn't come back to the dinner table. I asked him what he'd said to her. He looked at the table. He said he'd told her I needed space. I asked him if he'd told her that she'd announced, at her own dinner table, in front of his entire family, that his wife and daughter weren't welcome for Thanksgiving. He said she'd clarified that she meant it as an adults-only holiday. I asked him which of her 3 grandchildren at that table were adults. He didn't answer. So I opened my laptop and slid across the table. The spreadsheet my roommate had sent me was pulled up, color-coded, 18 months. Every deposit, every shortfall, every dollar I'd contributed to a vacation account that was apparently being repurposed without my knowledge. He stared at it for a long time. He said, "I didn't know she was this much." I said, "I know you didn't." And I meant it. That was the thing. He wasn't calculating. He just defaulted, the way people do when defaulting has never cost them anything. He deferred to his mother. He assumed I'd absorb it. He went back inside. I told him I needed 3 things. First, a conversation with his mother, not an apology tour. A direct acknowledgement of what had been said and what it communicated to Callie, even if Callie hadn't understood it yet. Second, the vacation fund redesignated to a personal account in my name only because I was no longer comfortable with the current arrangement. Third, we were going to sit down with a financial counselor, not a couples therapist, a financial counselor specifically, to look at our household contribution split and reset it to something equitable. He said, "That feels like a lot." I said, "It is a lot. Most of it I should have said 2 years ago." He was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "What if my mom won't meet with you?" I said, "Then I'll know what I need to know." His mother agreed to meet. It took 5 days and 2 phone calls, both of which my husband handled. She showed up to a coffee shop in her church clothes, which I mention only because it set a tone. She ordered tea. She let me speak first. I told her that what she'd said at the table, that Callie and I weren't included in Thanksgiving, had told me something I couldn't unhear, that my daughter had been seated separately from her cousins without explanation, that I had made food that sat untouched on a counter. I told her I wasn't there to relitigate the dinner. I was there to tell her clearly that I would not be attending family functions where my daughter was treated as an afterthought, and that I intended to hold that line. She stirred her tea. She said, "I've always treated Callie like my own." I let that sit there for a moment. Then I said, "I know you believe that," and I left it exactly there. She called my husband on the drive home and told him I was cold. He texted me what she'd said, which I thought was interesting, like he was reporting from a situation he'd decided not to be part of. I didn't respond to the text. I picked up Callie from school, took her to her soccer practice, watched her chase the ball around a muddy field with total commitment for an hour, and felt something settle in my chest. Not better exactly, more like level. The financial counselor we saw 2 weeks later had an office near downtown with parking validation, which I found unreasonably calming. She spent 40 minutes looking at our accounts before she said anything substantive. Then she looked at both of us and said, "There's a significant imbalance here that neither of you has formally addressed. That's not unusual, but it needs to be corrected going forward." My husband nodded. He'd been quieter since the spreadsheet. Not resentful quiet, more like someone recalibrating. The counselor outlined a revised split based on our actual take-home. She recommended we each maintain our own savings accounts with a shared household account for joint expenses only, with both names on the mortgage remaining unchanged. She said the vacation fund should be restructured with clear documentation of each contribution and a written agreement on use. We signed that agreement on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table after Callie was in bed. My husband used his nice pen. I used the one from the junk drawer. It was a mundane moment for something that felt to me like a structural repair. 2 months later, my mother-in-law hosted a birthday dinner for my father-in-law. She called and invited us. All three of us, she said. And she said Callie's name specifically. I noticed that. I don't know if my husband said something to her or if she'd thought about it on her own. I didn't ask. I made lemon bars this time. They were on the table before dinner, not the counter, and my mother-in-law pointed them out to her bridge club friend who was there as a guest and said, "My daughter-in-law made these." Her bridge club friend said they were the best thing on the table. My mother-in-law said, "She's always been a good baker." I chose to take that for what it was. Not everything, not enough, but something. Callie sat at the main table. She was between her cousins, and at some point during the main course she leaned over and whispered something to the youngest one, and they both laughed so hard. Her father had to tell them to settle down. I watched that and thought, this is what I stayed for. This is what I reorganized my life to protect. On the drive home, Callie fell asleep before we hit the highway. My husband reached over and put his hand on mine on the center console. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. The Portugal account has $11,400 in it now. We're going in April. I've already booked the apartments, one with a view of the river, one night in the Algarve. Callie asked me last week if Portugal has good bread. I told her yes, some of the best. She thought about that very seriously for a moment, then said, "Okay, I'm in. The casserole dish is back in my cabinet. I used it again last month for a potluck at work. My coworker asked for the recipe. I wrote it out on an index card and gave it to her. My grandmother's handwriting reproduced as close as I could remember it. Some things are worth holding on to. Some things you just carry differently.